The Ardennes, December 1944. A stretch of frozen ground near the Sauer River on the Luxembourg side of the German border. Here, in the last days of that month, several hundred men of the German 212th Volksgrenadier Division were ordered across the water before dawn, part of the great offensive meant to split the Allied armies and drive to the sea. They did everything their training required. They moved at night, they used the riverbank and the tree line for cover, and every experienced soldier among them knew the one hard lesson the Western Front had taught about American artillery. When the shells come, you get down. You press yourself into the earth, into a hole, into any depression the ground offers, and you wait for the barrage to lift. The fragments travel outward and upward from the point where a shell strikes the ground, and a man flat against the earth is, by a simple fact of geometry that had held true since the first industrial bombardments of 1914, largely safe from them. Many of these men had survived that way before, and then the American shells began to arrive, and they did not strike the ground. They burst in the air overhead, roughly 30 feet up, again and again, with a timing no German gunner could have achieved, and the fragments came straight down onto the men below. There was no hole deep enough. There was no posture that helped. Getting down, the one reliable defense they had trusted for the entire war, did nothing at all. Over 3 days along that river, 2 regiments of the division were effectively destroyed. The prisoners taken afterward, many of them teenagers of 17 and 18, told American interrogators about a new kind of artillery whose effect, in the phrasing that recurs in the reports, was terrific, and against which nothing they did seemed to help. It is a strange thing for soldiers to report. They were not saying the Americans had more guns, though they did. They were not saying the Americans were better shots. They were describing something closer to a violation of the rules, a sense that the protective logic they had relied on for their whole time in uniform had been quietly cancelled without anyone telling them. The cover still existed. The ground was still the ground. They got down exactly as they had been trained to, and it did not matter. So how did this happen? How did the same American artillery that German soldiers had learned to survive, by the well-understood discipline of taking cover, suddenly become something no cover could stop, in the space of a single winter? The answer is not that the Americans invented a bigger gun or a heavier shell. The guns were the same guns. The shells were, for the most part, the same shells. What changed was a small metal object screwed into the nose of each shell, an object so secret that the United States had spent more than 2 years deliberately refusing to use it over land, precisely because it was terrified of what would happen if one of them fell, unexploded, into German hands. That fear is the heart of this story, and it runs in the opposite direction from what you might expect. This is not a story about Americans capturing a German secret and turning it against its makers. It is very nearly the reverse. The secret was American, the nightmare was German, and the thing the American command feared most, for 2.5 years, was that the Germans would do to this weapon exactly what the title of any good espionage story promises: pick up the pieces of a dud, take it apart, understand it, and build their own. To understand why one small fuse inspired that level of caution, and why its release in the winter of 1944 felt to German soldiers like the ground rules of war had been rewritten, you have to go back to a problem that had frustrated gunners since artillery first began firing at things in the sky. The problem was time. For most of the history of explosive shells, if you wanted a shell to burst in the air, rather than on impact, you used a time fuse. Before firing, a gunner would set the fuse to a specific delay, so many seconds of burning powder or clockwork, calculated from the range to the target and the speed of the shell. If the calculation was perfect, the shell burst at the right height over the right spot. It almost never was perfect. Against a moving aircraft, the target had shifted by the time the shell arrived. Against troops on the ground, the fuse might function a fraction of a second too early and waste itself high in the air, or too late, and bury itself harmlessly in the dirt before going off. Anti-aircraft gunners in particular were firing enormous numbers of shells for very few hits. The Dream, an old one, was a shell that could sense for itself when it was close to the target and choose that exact instant to explode. A shell that did not need a human being to guess the timing in advance, because it did the deciding on its own, in flight, in the last fraction of a second. The scale of the waste is worth sitting with, because it explains why so much effort went into solving the problem. In the anti-aircraft role, a 5-inch naval gun firing conventional time fused shells might expend something on the order of 1,000 rounds for every aircraft it actually destroyed. The gunners were not incompetent. The task was simply close to impossible. A shell climbing to meet a fast aircraft several miles up had to be told, before it left the barrel, exactly how many seconds to fly before bursting, and the target was free to climb, dive, or turn in the interval. Miss the timing by a heartbeat, and the deadly cloud of fragments opened in empty sky. The same difficulty applied on land in a quieter way. To burst a shell at the ideal killing height over a trench, a gunner had to know the range with precision and set the fuse to match, and the terrain itself, a hill, a slope, a fold in the ground, could throw the calculation off. What everyone wanted was a shell that removed the guesswork by carrying its own judgment inside it. The idea was not originally American. British scientists had been working on the concept of a shell that could detect its own proximity to a target, and researchers including Samuel Curran, William Butemant, Edward Shire, and Amherst Thompson had explored the underlying principle, with Butemant's schematic design for a radar proximity fuse forming the basis that the American effort would later adopt with only minor changes. In the autumn of 1940, with Britain fighting for its survival in the skies over its own cities and unable to spare the industrial capacity to develop such a thing at scale, the concept crossed the Atlantic as part of a remarkable act of technical trust. A British delegation led by the physicist Henry Tizard travelled to the United States and handed over a collection of the country's most closely held scientific secrets. The prize of that collection was the cavity magnetron, the device that made compact, powerful radar possible, and historians have called it one of the most valuable cargoes ever brought to American shores. Alongside radar and a raft of other secrets, the delegation carried the seed of the proximity fuse. The reasoning behind the gift was hard-headed. Britain had the ideas but not the factories, and the United States had the factories. Rather than let promising concepts wither for lack of production capacity, the British chose to share them with a country not yet in the war, betting that American industry could turn British invention into weapons faster than Britain could alone. In August 1940, the American Navy formally asked the country's new science mobilization body to take up the challenge of a rugged proximity fuse that could survive the violent forces of a gun and still function. What the Americans did with that request over the next 4 years turned a promising laboratory idea into one of the most closely guarded weapons of the entire war, ranked in hindsight alongside radar, code-breaking, and the atomic bomb as one of the handful of secret projects on which Allied victory most heavily depended. The work was assigned to a body with a deliberately dull name, the National Defense Research Committee, which soon folded into the Office of Scientific Research and Development, headed by the engineer Vannevar Bush. Within that structure, the Fuse project was handed to a group known simply as Section T. It began in August 1940 at the Department of Terrestrial Magnetism, part of the Carnegie Institution of Washington, and it was led by a physicist named Merle Tuve. As the effort grew, it moved to a new home that would become famous in its own right, the Applied Physics Laboratory of Johns Hopkins University in Silver Spring, Maryland. The team Tuve assembled included researchers whose names would echo far beyond the war. One of them, James Van Allen, would later give his name to the belts of radiation that surround the Earth, discovered in the earliest days of the space age. In the early 1940s, though, Van Allen and his colleagues were wrestling with a problem that many capable engineers considered simply impossible. The idea itself was clear enough: build a tiny radio transmitter and receiver into the nose of an artillery shell. Have it broadcast a continuous signal as it flew. When that signal bounced back off a nearby object, the ground, an aircraft, a human body, the returning echo would grow stronger as the distance closed. At a preset strength, corresponding to a preset distance, the fuse would fire the shell. In effect, every shell carried a miniature radar set that measured its own approach to the target and detonated at the optimum moment. That was the concept. The engineering was a nightmare of a different kind. Consider what the inside of that fuse had to endure. When a 5-inch naval gun fires, the shell is subjected to an acceleration of roughly 20,000 times the force of gravity. In the same instant, the rifling in the barrel sets the shell spinning at something close to 30,000 revolutions per minute, which is about 500 turns every second. Now imagine placing inside that shell a set of delicate glass vacuum tubes, the fragile electronic components of 1940s radio technology, the same kind of tubes that sat protected inside a household wireless set and could be broken by dropping the radio off a table. Those tubes had to survive being fired from a cannon. They had to keep working while enduring a punishment that would flatten any ordinary piece of electronics into scrap. Most engineers who looked at the problem concluded it could not be done. German scientists, working on their own proximity fuse concepts, examined the same challenge and decided that a vacuum tube, tough enough to survive firing, was beyond what the technology of the day could deliver. They were not being lazy or foolish. Given what their laboratories had managed to test, it was a reasonable conclusion. It was also wrong. The American team solved it through sheer stubborn engineering. They redesigned the tubes to be smaller, more rugged, cushioned against shock. Their internal parts braced so they could not shatter under the strain. They packed the delicate components in wax and oil so that the stresses of firing pressed on them evenly from all sides, rather than tearing them apart. They developed a battery to power the fuse that was ingenious in its own right. It stored its chemicals inert, sealed inside a small glass container, so the fuse could sit in a warehouse or an ammunition crate for months, perfectly dead and stable. The shock of firing shattered that glass container, and the spin of the shell flung the released liquid outward against metal plates, where a chemical reaction generated the electric current that woke the fuse up. Built into that sequence was a deliberate delay of several thousandths of a second, so the fuse would not arm until the shell had safely cleared the gun and the crew standing around it. Each finished fuse packed roughly 130 miniature components into a space at the tip of a shell, and then they had to build them not by the dozen, but by the tens of millions. Turning the naval fuse into one that worked for the Army's field artillery brought a fresh set of headaches, because a howitzer is not a naval gun. A field howitzer could fire the same shell using different amounts of propellant depending on the range, and each different charge sent the shell out at a different speed and a different rate of spin. The researchers found themselves designing a fuse that had to function reliably across a whole range of different combinations of velocity and spin, by one account close to 30 of them. There was also the plain question nobody had a ready answer for. What was the best height for a shell to burst over a man on the ground? Too high and the fragments lost their bite before they arrived. Too low and the pattern was too small. The team worked it out experimentally, laying boards flat on the ground, bursting shells above them, and studying the pattern of holes the fragments punched to measure how the lethal spray spread at different heights. They learned that the ideal burst height depended on the size of the gun. For the common 105mm and 155mm pieces, it worked out to roughly 30 feet, while for a giant 240mm howitzer, the best height was more than 70 feet up. To test all of this, the Army used an anti-aircraft range at Kirtland in New Mexico, where something close to 50,000 test firings were carried out across the middle years of the war. This was not a lucky accident of a weapon. It was ground out, shot by shot, over years. The manufacturing effort became an industrial secret on the scale of the atomic bomb project, and it is worth pausing on the numbers, because they explain why the weapon inspired the caution it did. Producing the miniature vacuum tubes alone consumed an astonishing share of American capacity. The Sylvania Company built the overwhelming majority of them, employing around 10,000 workers, most of them women, and at peak was turning out 1 million tubes every 2.5 days. That single output was roughly 2/3 the rate of the entire pre-war American radio industry, devoted to one component of one fuse. Over the course of the war, well over 100 companies were drawn into producing the fuses and their parts, an unlikely roster that included radio and appliance makers like Crosley and RCA, the camera company Eastman Kodak, General Electric, and even the Wurlitzer Company, better known for jukeboxes and organs. By the end of the war, American industry had produced around 22 million proximity fuses. The cost per fuse collapsed as production scaled, from over $700 for an early unit down to about $18 apiece, and the total program ran to something on the order of $1 billion. Admiral Lewis Strauss would later call it one of the most original and effective military developments of the entire war. If stories like this one interest you, the hidden engineering and the decisions behind what actually happened in combat, consider subscribing and leaving a like. It genuinely helps this kind of detailed history reach more people. The name itself was part of the secrecy. Officially, the device was called the Variable Time Fuse, or VT fuse, and that name was chosen precisely because it was misleading. Variable time suggested nothing more exotic than a refined version of the old adjustable time fuse that every artillery officer already understood. It gave away nothing about the miniature radar hidden inside. The men who used it in the field came up with their own names. Some called it the funny fuse. In some artillery circles it went by a code name, Posit. But whatever it was called, the principle was the same. It was a shell that could sense the ground, or an aircraft, or a body, and decide for itself when to explode. Its first proven use came not on land but at sea, where the reasoning behind 2 years of restraint reveals itself. On the morning of January 5, 1943, in the waters near Guadalcanal in the Pacific, a group of Japanese dive bombers came at an American task force. These were Aichi dive bombers, known to the Allies by the reporting name Val, slow and by then somewhat dated aircraft, but accurate and hard to knock down. As the attackers broke off, the anti-aircraft gunners aboard the light cruiser Helena sent up a barrage from her 5-inch guns. 2 salvos brought one of the dive bombers down, and the telling detail is that no shell actually struck the aircraft. One of Helena's shells passed close enough for its proximity fuse to sense the plane and detonate, and the burst of fragments tore the bomber out of the sky. It was, by most accounts, the first aircraft ever destroyed in combat by a proximity fuse, the first time a near miss had been deliberately turned into a kill. Against aircraft, the weapon was transformative. Because the shell no longer had to strike the plane directly, and no longer depended on a gunner guessing the perfect fuse delay, its effectiveness leapt upward. Estimates at the time suggested the proximity fuse made 5-inch anti-aircraft fire something like several times more deadly than the old-time fused shells, with one calculation by Vannevar Bush putting the improvement for that gun at roughly 7-fold. The fragment pattern that could reliably reach and damage a target was vastly larger than before. The numbers from that first year bear the improvement out. Across 1943, American 5-inch guns fired something over 9,000 proximity fuzzed rounds and knocked down 61 aircraft. That worked out to roughly 155 shells for every kill, against a figure of around 500 shells per kill for the old-time fuzzed ammunition over the same period. The weapon roughly tripled the killing power of a gun that had cost the same to build and took the same crew to fire. Through the rest of that year, the Pacific remained the main theater for the new fuse, precisely because the ocean swallowed the misses. It also saw limited naval use defending the invasion beaches at Salerno and later at Anzio in the Mediterranean, again over water where a dud would sink. Everywhere it went, though, the same iron rule followed it. The shells were too valuable and their secret too fragile to risk over ground the enemy might reach. And here is where the fear enters the story. The fear that would keep this weapon leashed for 2.5 years. A shell fired out over the ocean at an airplane, if it missed, fell into the sea. Whatever was inside, it sank beyond recovery. But a shell fired over land, if its fuse failed to function, simply fell to earth intact. A dud. And a dud could be found. It could be picked up, carried away, taken into a laboratory, and taken apart. The Allied command understood exactly what that meant. If a single working proximity fuse fell into German or Japanese hands, enemy scientists might reverse engineer it. Worse, they might turn the same technology against Allied bombers, filling the skies over Germany with anti-aircraft shells that no longer needed to guess, shredding the bomber formations that were central to the Allied war effort. The British had, earlier in the war, recovered a German magnetic naval mine that had come down on land instead of in the water, taken it apart, understood how it worked, and developed the countermeasures that blunted it. Everyone involved knew the same trick could be run in reverse against the proximity fuse. So a rule was imposed, and it was strict. The fuse could be used over water, where duds sank beyond reach. It could not be fired over land, where a failed round would lie in a field waiting to be picked up. There was also a calculated judgment about which enemy was the greater risk. Of the Axis powers, Japan was thought least likely to be able to reverse engineer the device or to develop a way to jam it, which made the Pacific the safer place to use it. When American naval guns fired proximity-fused shells in support of the landings at Gela during the invasion of Sicily in the summer of 1943, the concern about recovery was real and immediate. The weapon was so valuable that its owners deliberately kept its single most useful application, bursting shells in the air over enemy troops on the ground, off the table entirely, for years, while soldiers who could have used it died without ever knowing it existed. The caution went further still. Vannevar Bush quietly arranged for a separate group of American scientists to develop a way to jam the proximity fuse, to defeat it electronically. His reasoning was simple and revealing. If the fuse could be beaten, the Americans wanted to be the first to discover how, before an enemy did. That is the level of anxiety a single small device generated. The people who built it spent part of their effort figuring out how to destroy their own creation, just in case. The first crack in the wall of restriction came in the summer of 1944, and it came over Britain, and specifically over the sea approaches to it. In the middle of June 1944, Germany began launching the V-1 flying bomb, the small, pilotless jet-powered machine that droned across the Channel toward London. They came by the thousand. From the opening of the campaign through the end of August, the Germans launched something like 9,300 of them, an average of around 120 a day. Shooting these down with conventional anti-aircraft fire was maddeningly difficult. They were small, fast, and flew a steady low course that gave the gunners very little margin, and time-fuzzed shells struggled to catch them. But the V-1s crossed the coast over open water, which meant proximity-fuzzed shells fired at them would fall harmlessly into the sea when they missed. The geometry that made land use forbidden elsewhere made this particular battle permissible, and the United States authorized proximity fuses for the defense of London in the middle of June 1944. The results were staggering. As the gun crews learned to handle the new shells, and as they were combined with radar-directed gun laying, the proportion of flying bombs destroyed as they crossed the coastal gun belt climbed week by week. In the early days, it sat around 17%. By the fourth week of the campaign, proximity-fused anti-aircraft fire was accounting for something approaching 4 out of every 5 flying bombs that came within reach of the guns. And in the last week of August, it reached about 74%, touching into the 80s on the best single days. The number of shells needed to bring down each flying bomb fell from thousands to around 100. One member of the fuse development team wrote plainly that the device had saved the lives of thousands of people in London. The proximity fuse had proven itself again, and pressure began to build to let it off its leash for use on the ground. In late October 1944, the combined chiefs of staff approved the use of proximity fuses over land for anti-aircraft defense, initially to protect the vital port of Antwerp from the flying bombs Germany was aiming at it. There too the results were dramatic, with an anti-aircraft battalion reportedly destroying a large share of the first flying bombs it engaged. But the biggest prize, the one the artillerymen had wanted from the beginning, was still forbidden. Using the proximity fuse not against aircraft, but against enemy soldiers on the ground, bursting shells in the air over infantry and gun crews and vehicles, remained off-limits. That final barrier would not fall until the Germans themselves knocked it down, with an offensive that changed the calculation overnight. On December 16, 1944, the German army launched its great surprise attack through the forests of the Ardennes, the offensive the world would come to call the Battle of the Bulge. Concentrating armor and infantry against a thinly held stretch of American line, the Germans tore a bulge into the front and threw the defenders into crisis. And in the middle of that crisis, the entire reasoning behind the land use restriction suddenly reversed itself. For 2.5 years, the fear had been that a captured Fuze would let Germany reverse engineer the technology and use it against Allied bombers before the war ended. But by the end of 1944, Germany was visibly losing. Its industry was being pounded from the air, its resources were collapsing, and the prospect of it developing and mass-producing a copied proximity Fuze in time to matter had all but vanished. The thing the Allies had been protecting against was no longer a realistic danger. Meanwhile, here was a massed German offensive presenting exactly the kind of target, troops in the open, moving through cold and difficult terrain, that the proximity Fuze had been designed in its gunners' dreams to destroy. The math had flipped. The benefit was now enormous and immediate. The risk was now small and fading. Within roughly 2 days of the offensive beginning, the restriction on using proximity Fuzes against ground targets was lifted. The very first ground use appears to have jumped the gun on formal permission. In fact, the release had already been loosely planned. The general clearance for land use had been penciled in for around Christmas, and the German offensive simply forced the schedule forward. The anti-aircraft Fuzes were released for immediate use as the attack opened, and the Field Artillery airburst Fuzes followed about 2 days later. But at least one American commander did not wait even for that. In the fighting around Monschau, at the northern edge of the German assault, the enemy struck at a lightly armed cavalry reconnaissance squadron dug in to hold the line. On the morning of December 16, the commander of the American Field Artillery Group supporting them, an officer named Axelson, whose first name and exact unit number are given differently in different accounts, faced a hard choice. He had crates of the new secret shells on hand and troops who badly needed the help, and he did not yet have formal permission to fire them at ground targets. He decided the emergency outranked the rule and ordered his gunners to use the new shells anyway. 3 days after that group broke the embargo, on December 19th, General Eisenhower formally asked for clearance to use the Fuze on the ground, and 2 days after that, every remaining restriction came off. Across the American front, gunners began screwing the funny Fuze into their shells and firing it at German soldiers for the first time. What happened next is the German nightmare the whole story has been building toward, and it is best seen through the specific action along the Sauer River that opened this account. General George Patton, whose Third Army was wheeling north to strike the underside of the German Bulge, had actually watched a demonstration of the proximity Fuze on the very day the offensive began, seeing for himself how the shells burst at a consistent height above uneven ground, where an old-time Fuze would have been fooled. Now his artillery had the weapon in quantity. In the sector held by the 5th Infantry Division, German troops of the 212th Volksgrenadier Division were attempting to force a crossing of the Sauer, pushing men across the cold river in boats and on foot. American observers called down artillery, and the shells arrived fuzzed to burst in the air above the crossing points, roughly 30 feet over the heads of men who had no overhead cover of any kind. The effect on soldiers caught in the open, in and around a river, was catastrophic. American infantrymen took to calling it a Christmas present for the Germans. Over 3 days, the German attack across that river was shattered. 2 regiments of the division were effectively wiped out, and the prisoners who came in, many of them boys of 17 and 18, described the terrific effect of a new kind of artillery Fuze against which nothing they did seemed to help. The numbers Patton put to it were blunt. He wrote a letter to the Chief of Army Ordnance, Major General Levin Campbell, describing what the new shell had done. He reported that his forces had caught a German battalion trying to cross the Sauer and, with a concentrated barrage, had killed by actual count 702 of them. He added a thought that reached past the battle in front of him. He wrote that when every army eventually got hold of this shell, warfare itself would have to be reinvented, because the old methods would no longer serve, and he closed with a gunner's satisfaction that his side had thought of it first. Separately, Patton is remembered for a shorter and more sweeping verdict, the remark that the funny Fuze had won the Battle of the Bulge. That line is often quoted, and it captures how the weapon struck the men who saw it work, but it is worth keeping in proportion. Historians who have studied the campaign note that the Fuze was released for ground use only partway through the battle and was fired in real quantity only in its later stages, so it is better understood as one sharp advantage among many than as the single thing that decided the outcome. What is not in dispute is the effect it had where it was used. Patton was not, as a rule, a man who liked to credit equipment over the fighting men who served it, and the exception he made here measures how completely the weapon had changed the arithmetic of survival under bombardment. The same story repeated all along the front through those December days. Around the town of Malmedy, American artillery battalions used the new Fuze against attacking German troops, some of them men of the special unit led by the commando officer Otto Skorzeny. The airbursts so unnerved the attackers that some of them, rather than going to ground where the shells found them anyway, charged directly toward the guns, and there are accounts of German soldiers running into the fire, calling out the word for comrade, trying to surrender rather than endure another minute of it. By around December 23, only days after the Fuze was unleashed on the ground, American estimates put the number of German soldiers killed by proximity fuzzed shells in the fighting at as many as 2,000. General Patton would later credit the weapon not only with the broad victory, but specifically with helping save the city of Liège, an important supply hub in the German path. In the fighting in the Hürtgen forest, an American infantry division caught a German patrol in the open with a proximity fuzzed concentration, a time-on-target mission in which the shells of many batteries were coordinated to arrive at the same instant. When it was over, 96 German dead were counted, caught by airbursts against which the trees and the ground offered no shelter. The fragments did not merely fall on exposed men, they came down hard enough to penetrate the log-reinforced roofs that soldiers built over their fighting positions for exactly the kind of protection that had always worked before. Trenches gave no protection, shell holes gave no protection, and from the German side came the words that give this whole account its center of gravity. A captured German soldier described the new air-bursting artillery as a series of quick, powerful bursts for which there was simply no defense. The effect on morale ran deep. There are accounts of German troops, ordered to move or to leave the relative safety of their bunkers during artillery fire, refusing to obey outright. A small mutiny, born of the simple fact that the new shells had made the open ground feel like certain death, in a way the old artillery never had. German commanders grew so desperate to understand what was killing their men that intelligence reports noted they had offered a reward to any soldier who could recover an intact, unexploded specimen of the new Fuze. To grasp why the proximity Fuze hit German soldiers as a kind of betrayal of the rules, you have to understand the defense it defeated, because that defense was the single most basic survival skill of the 20th century infantryman. Since the industrial bombardments of the First World War, every soldier had been taught the same thing about artillery. When the shells come, get low, get into a trench, a shell hole, a fold in the ground, and make yourself as flat as possible. The reason was physical and dependable. A shell that struck the ground sent most of its lethal fragments outward and upward, in a spray that spread as it rose. A man lying flat in a hole was below the worst of that cone of steel. Much of it passed over him. Generations of soldiers had survived bombardments this way. It was not a trick or a guess. It was geometry, and geometry does not change its mind. The proximity Fuze did not break that geometry. It simply moved the explosion. Instead of bursting when it hit the ground, sending fragments up and out, the proximity fuzzed shell burst while still in the air, 30 to 50 feet overhead, and threw its fragments down and out, raining steel onto the tops of everything below. The hole that had always been a refuge became a trap with no lid. Lying flat, the posture that had always reduced a man's exposure now presented the widest possible target to fragments falling from above. Every instinct these soldiers had been trained to trust told them to do the exact thing that now got them killed. This is the source of the confusion in those interrogation reports. The prisoners were not describing a weapon that was merely more powerful. They were describing the collapse of a rule they had staked their lives on. Get down, and you live. Suddenly, get down, and it made no difference at all. And here the story reaches an irony that is worth telling carefully, because it comes down to us mainly through the memory of one man, rather than the official record. The scientist who had been asked to build a jammer for America's own Fuze, Winfield Salisbury, recalled after the war that during the Battle of the Bulge, the Germans captured a stock of around 20,000 proximity fused shells. If his account is right, it means the very thing the United States had guarded for years, at the level of the atomic project, had finally fallen into German hands. And by his telling, it made no difference at all. The Germans, he said, had been told by their own engineers that proximity fuzzed shells were impossible, because nothing so delicate could survive the forces of being fired from a gun. Having already decided the thing could not exist, they did not recognize what they had captured. The prize sat in their hands and told them nothing, because their own certainty had walled them off from the answer. It is right to flag that this particular episode rests largely on Salisbury's personal recollection and is not well corroborated in the standard histories of the Fuze, so the exact numbers and details should be held loosely. What is firmly documented is the shape of the thing. American commanders treated the Fuzes as their most sensitive ammunition, to be destroyed before capture whenever a position was threatened, and Vannevar Bush had quietly commissioned a jammer against the day the enemy might turn the technology back on Allied aircraft. Yet the broader fear, the one that had kept the weapon leashed for 2.5 years, never materialized. Germany never reverse-engineered the Fuze and never built a jammer of its own. The catastrophe the planners had guarded against for so long simply never arrived, in part because the enemy's own confident conclusion that the weapon could not exist had blinded him to it. There is one more thread to this story, and it is the thread that the plain image of a captured ammunition dump belongs to most naturally, because it is real, and it ran in the ordinary, unglamorous direction, Americans taking German materiel rather than the reverse. While American scientists were guarding their proximity Fuze with the intensity of the atomic project, American soldiers on the ground were doing something older and far more improvised with the enemy's own weapons. They were capturing German guns and German ammunition and turning them straight back on the people who had made them. This was not a marginal curiosity. It was, in places, organized policy driven by a hard, practical problem. As the Allied armies drove across France and toward Germany in the autumn of 1944, they repeatedly outran their own supply lines. Fuel and ammunition could not always keep pace with the advance. Artillery, which won battles by sheer volume of fire, was rationed at exactly the moments it was most needed, and all around the advancing Americans lay the debris of a retreating German army, including intact guns and, crucially, large stocks of German ammunition abandoned in dumps or overrun in position. To a gunner short of shells, a captured German gun with crates of matching German ammunition beside it was not a trophy. It was a working weapon, and the enemy had thoughtfully left the ammunition to feed it. During the long, grinding fight for the fortress city of Metz in the autumn of 1944, the American 20 Corps turned this into a deliberate operation. Facing ammunition shortages, the Corps pressed captured enemy artillery into service on a substantial scale, assembling a mixed collection of guns of various origins, German pieces prominent among them, along with older weapons of French and Russian manufacture that had themselves been captured by the Germans earlier in the war and then captured a second time by the Americans. Across that period, the Corps fired tens of thousands of rounds of captured ammunition. By one detailed accounting, roughly 30,920 rounds of captured ammunition were fired, a tonnage in the hundreds of tons, valued in the accounting of the day at over $700,000. The enemy's own shells, fired from the enemy's own guns, fell on the enemy's own troops, and every round of it was ammunition the American supply chain did not have to haul across France. The Patton showed up all along the front wherever the calibers happened to match. Captured French 155mm howitzer ammunition, found in large dumps near Verdun and Soissons, fit the American 155mm howitzer almost perfectly, and for a stretch of the autumn, one American corps drew that entire category of ammunition from captured stocks rather than from its own supply. American self-propelled guns fired thousands of rounds of captured 155mm ammunition against the concrete fortifications of the German West Wall, the Siegfried Line, using Germany's leftover shells to break Germany's own defenses. Old French 75mm ammunition, of a type dating back to the First World War, fit the gun on some American tanks, and in at least one action around the Metz forts, an American tank unit fired French ammunition exclusively, and the German infantry mortar, the 81mm, fired a bomb close enough to the American 81mm mortar's ammunition that they could be used interchangeably. Over the course of the campaign, American forces fired something like 300,000 rounds of captured German mortar ammunition back at German positions. There is a specific and vivid image from the Battle of the Bulge that captures the whole idea. In Luxembourg, during that same December fighting, an American heavy artillery battalion, a unit normally equipped with long-barreled 155mm guns, got its hands on a captured German 88mm gun, the most feared artillery and anti-tank weapon in the German arsenal, the gun whose very name struck a particular dread into Allied soldiers. American tractors towed the captured 88 into position. American gunners cleaned the German shells, loaded them, and fired the Germans' own most famous weapon back into the German pockets, pressing against the flanks of the Bulge. Photographs taken at the time show it happening, the American crew working a captured German gun in the snow in late December 1944. It is worth being careful and honest about what this thread is and is not, because the popular version of these stories often drifts into exaggeration. There is a claim, repeated in some secondary accounts, that the American Army formally re-equipped a couple of its artillery battalions entirely with captured German guns to exploit the enemy ammunition. The solid documentary record does not clearly support that neat version. What it supports is messier and, in a way, more interesting. It shows improvised batteries, provisional arrangements, gunners solving a supply problem with whatever the retreating enemy had left behind, corps-level decisions to fire captured stocks rather than let good ammunition sit idle. The turning of the enemy's arms against him in this war was less a tidy program and more a running act of battlefield thrift, carried out at the scale of tens and hundreds of thousands of rounds. Now set the two threads beside each other, because together they answer the question this story began with. On one side, a secret so precious that the United States refused for 2.5 years to fire it over land, terrified that a single recovered dud would let the enemy copy it. On the other, the everyday reality of American soldiers scooping up abandoned German guns and shells and firing them straight back without a second thought. The contrast is the whole point. The proximity fuse was a secret worth protecting at almost any cost, because it was decades ahead of anything the enemy could field, and could not be improvised or replaced if compromised. Captured German ammunition was the opposite kind of resource, valuable precisely because it could be used immediately, openly, and without any fear at all, since the enemy already possessed the technology by definition. One was guarded like the crown jewels, the other was spent like loose change, and both, in the winter of 1944, were falling on German soldiers. The deeper reason the proximity fuse mattered so much is not really about the fuse at all. It is about a difference in how two war machines had learned to think about hitting a target. For most of the war, and for the German army in particular, the killing of a soldier followed a chain of steps that everyone understood. You located the enemy, you calculated, you fired, you corrected. The whole apparatus of artillery assumed that a human being, somewhere in the chain, was making the crucial timing decision, and the quality of that decision determined whether the shell did its work. The proximity fuse quietly removed the human from the most important instant of that chain. It let the shell make the final decision, in flight, in the last fraction of a second, with a precision no human gunner could match, at a scale of millions of shells. The gunner still aimed at the ground the enemy occupied, but the shell itself chose the perfect height to kill the men standing on that ground. And because the American war machine could produce this thing by the tens of millions and put it into the hands of ordinary field artillery batteries, it was not a special weapon reserved for special occasions. It became, in the last months of the war, simply how American artillery worked. The Germans, who had examined the same idea and judged it impossible, had no answer and no equivalent. This was not for lack of trying or lack of talent. German scientists explored a remarkable range of proximity fuse designs across the war, somewhere between 30 and 50 distinct approaches by some counts. Some used radio, in the same family as the American solution. Some were acoustic, meant to trigger on the engine sound of an approaching aircraft. One design pursued by a major German arms firm worked on the principle of a change in the electrical field around the shell as it neared a target. They built prototypes and tested them. But two things defeated them. The first was timing and priority. Early in the war, in 1940, with victory seeming close, German research effort was deliberately pulled away from projects that could not be finished within a few months, in order to concentrate on weapons that could be used immediately, and proximity fuse work at one leading firm was halted for that reason, at precisely the moment sustained effort might have paid off. The second and deeper problem was the same wall the Americans had climbed. A fuse needed a rugged amplifying device, in that era, a vacuum tube that could survive the shock and spin of being fired from a gun. German engineers examined that requirement and concluded it could not be met with the technology available. They were making a judgment that looked entirely sound on paper. It simply turned out to be wrong, because an American team had been willing to pour years and a fortune into proving it wrong. So Germany went into the final winter of the war, facing a weapon its own experts had formally concluded should not be able to exist, with no defense against it, no way to reply in kind, and, as it turned out, no ability even to recognize the device when a crate of them fell into their hands. The soldiers at the Sauer River were not being unlucky or unskilled. They were standing on the wrong side of a technological gap that their own country's best scientists had helped to open, by betting, reasonably but wrongly, that the gap could not be crossed. It matters here that the fuse did not arrive into an empty field. It arrived on top of what was probably the finest artillery system any army fielded in the war, and the combination is what produced the slaughter. American field artillery had been built around the idea of massing fire quickly and flexibly. At the heart of it sat the Fire Direction Center, a command arrangement that let a single observer, sometimes a junior officer far forward with nothing but a radio, call for fire and have the guns of many separate batteries compute their solutions and drop their shells onto one point at the same moment. A coordinated strike of this kind, where dozens of shells from batteries scattered across the landscape all landed together in a single devastating instant, was something the German army struggled to match, because its own procedures leaned on more deliberate calculation and pre-surveyed positions. The Americans had also pushed radios down to a level that let observation and correction happen fast, and they used light spotter aircraft, small unarmed planes drifting over the battlefield, whose mere presence overhead could silence German guns unwilling to reveal themselves. Layered onto all of that was a genuine flood of ammunition, an industrial abundance that let American gunners fire on suspicion and saturation in a way their opponents, chronically short of shells, simply could not afford. Now drop the proximity fuse into that machine. A forward observer sees, or merely suspects, German troops massing in a wood or crossing a river. He calls a single set of map coordinates. Within minutes, the shells of many batteries converge on that spot, all arriving together, and every one of them bursts 30 to 50 feet in the air above the target, rather than in the dirt. The men below have no warning that would let them do anything useful, and even if they had, the one thing they know to do, get down, is the thing that now kills them. The fuse made each shell far deadlier. The system made sure a devastating number of those shells could be delivered onto an unseen target in the time it took men to react. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, before he was wounded in an air attack and forced out of the war earlier that year, had already put his finger on the broader truth from the German side. Writing about the fighting in the West, he pointed not to any single American wonder weapon, but to the crushing weight and coordination of American artillery, its great superiority in guns, and its outstandingly large supply of ammunition. Rommel was among the finest practitioners of mobile war in the German officer corps, and he was not describing better American marksmanship or German failure of nerve. He was describing a system, an integrated capacity to deliver overwhelming fire on demand, and admitting frankly that the German army had no comparable answer to it. The proximity fuse was simply the sharpest edge of that system, and in the winter of 1944, that edge was pressed against soldiers who had no idea what it even was. If you are finding this account worthwhile, a like helps it reach more viewers, and subscribing means you will not miss the next deep look into the parts of this war that rarely make it into the standard telling. There is a quiet irony in how the war ended for this weapon and its secret. The thing the Allies had feared for 2.5 years, that the enemy would capture the fuse and reverse engineer it, never came to pass in any way that mattered. By the time the proximity fuse was raining down on German troops in the Ardennes in the open, and duds were surely falling into German-held ground, Germany no longer had the time, the industry, or the future in which a copied fuse could have changed anything. The secret had been guarded fiercely through the years when guarding it mattered, and then, at exactly the moment its protection stopped being worth the cost, it was unleashed. The timing was not luck. It was a cold and correct reading of when a secret is an asset to be hidden and when it becomes a weapon to be spent. And the German soldiers who met that weapon in the field never really understood, in the moment, what had happened to them. They understood the effect, they felt the air bursts, and saw that getting down no longer saved them, and told their captors there was no defense. But the cause, a miniature radar built by companies that in peacetime made jukeboxes and cameras, sitting in the nose of an ordinary shell, deciding on its own when to explode, was invisible to them and would have sounded like fantasy if described. They had trained inside a model of war in which a man who took cover survived the shell. That model had been quietly repealed by a device small enough to sit in the palm of a hand, produced by the tens of millions, screwed into shells that were otherwise unremarkable. The men at the edge of the Sauer River had done everything right by the only rules they had ever been given. They crossed at night, they used the cover. When the shells came, they got down, and the fragments still found them from above, because the shells above them had been built to make that one reliable defense meaningless. They were the inheritors of a way of surviving war that reached back to 1914, and it failed them not because they did anything wrong, but because the ground rules they trusted had been rewritten in a laboratory in Maryland by men they would never hear of, and shipped to the front by an industry that could make the impossible ordinary. The captured German guns firing German shells back into the Bulge were the visible, almost poetic form of turning the enemy's own war against him. The small metal fuse in the nose of an American shell was the invisible form, and it was the one that truly rewrote the rules. One was thrift, the other was revolution. The German soldiers at the river met them both in the same cold December, and only one of them would go on to change how every army on earth thought about taking cover under fire. If this account gave you something to think about, hit the like button and subscribe. It is how stories like this one reach the people who care about getting the history right.